Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's discussion on the end of policing. My name is David Sugarman, and I'm one of the organizers of this event and of this series of events that this is part of, which is COVID-19 and its Afterlives, a series that is being co-sponsored by NYU, Verso Books, and N+1. And I would just be grateful if everybody could take some time to have a look at the website for this series, which also features some incredible original essays and scholarship. You'll find that in the collection of writing on the website. And additionally, a list of our forthcoming events, which will run through the spring of 2022, and also an archive of our previous events, which include a discussion of the 1918 pandemic, and as well as an event on US-China relations and talk from Professor Andy Liu. Another thing I'd like to mention is one of our partners, Kem Wagner Archives in NYU, will be sponsoring an event tomorrow night, and the link for that will be in the chat below, which will be a discussion about the 10th anniversary of Occupy Wall Street. A couple logistical things up front. You'll find that there's a live transcript, closed captioning of this evening's talk, which you can access by clicking the CC button on the bottom of Zoom. And we'd also welcome your questions for a discussion to be had after the event. And you will be able to pose questions all through the talks by clicking on the Q&A button below. Please don't use the chat, it won't work. I don't even know if you could see the chat, but if you can, please don't use it. Use the Q&A instead. And with that, I welcome you. Thank you all for joining us. And I pass the mic over to Ben Mabie, who is an editor over at Verso Books and is going to introduce tonight's talk.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. And thanks everyone who's attending tonight and the crew behind the event, especially to Zach and Jay at NYU Skirball, managing the tech side today, all the institutional support that this kind of series has gotten from all the different kind of wings of NYU. Special shout outs obviously also owed to David himself, as well as Daniel Chang, who have assembled such an impressive lineup of speakers throughout this kind of fall, stretching all through the autumn. If you haven't already caught some of the past events, the event with Angie Liu and Charmaine Chua on logistics and China and COVID was really remarkable. You should go find a recording online if it's up already. And I think it's an indication of the kind of quality of conversations that Daniel and David have kind of thoughtfully curated for us. Tonight we're going to be discussing what is, without exaggeration, one of the most important and vital events in American politics in the 21st century, the George Floyd Rebellion, as well as the organizing against police terror that's carried in a sometimes quieter key over the course of the last year, and the backlash to both that's kind of been contemporaneous with the movement since before even the destruction of the 3rd precinct in Minneapolis. I think we're really lucky to be joined by two comrades tonight, both really stellar organizers and thinkers who have been key voices in this much larger chorus. They've been making sense about what this moment means, now nearly 18 months on from the start of the uprising, but also making history with their contributions in the long and protracted struggle against police and prisons. We have Alex Vitale, who's an author and professor of sociology at Brooklyn College. He's the coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College. His writings appeared in the New York Times, The Nation, The Appeal, USA Today, Vice News, and other media outlets. He's, of course, also the author of The End of Policing, which is a resource without rival when it comes to making the case against police reform. And Verso is very proud to be bringing out a new and expanded edition out in December of this year. You can pre-order that version for a very affordable price in the link below. It's going to kind of bring the argument up to speed, up to date with all the kind of skirmishes we've seen around defund since last summer. And we also have Kay Gabriel, who's a writer, a teacher, an organizer, an active member of NYC DSA's Defund the Police campaign. She probably doesn't want me to mention this, but she's also an excellent poet. She's got an edited anthology, We Want It All, and a chapbook, Kissing Other People, or The House of Fame. Which are both really good. You should check them out. We're going to have plenty of time for an engaged discussion and Q&A. So as David said, we want your thoughts. Please drop them in the Q&A tab or box, just kind of running along that menu at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We're going to kind of get started first with Alex, a conversation with Alex, then with Kay. And after those presentations, we're going to kick it out to discussion with you and look forward to a kind of engaged discussion through the evening. But Alex, why don't you take it away? Get us started.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks to everyone at Skirball. And I'm really happy to be in discussion with both Ben and Kay about this obviously important issue. So In 2014, after the police killings of Mike Brown and Eric Garner and Tamir Rice and so many others, we were told, don't worry, we're going to fix policing. We're going to reform the police. President Obama created a task force on 21st century policing that issued a whole raft of recommendations about how to reform the police, how to restore legitimacy in the police, how to restore public trust in the police. Here in New York City, the NYPD received body cameras, de-escalation training, implicit bias training. The CCRB was strengthened. There were new oversight mechanisms put in place. The officers involved in the killing of George Floyd in Minnesota had had implicit bias training, de-escalation training, mindfulness training. We're wearing body cameras. We're operating under a new, more restrictive use of force policy. We're operating under a policy, a bystander policy that required that officers intervene if they saw misconduct by a fellow officer. And they were operating under a new early warning system designed to identify problematic officers like Derek Chauvin. And none of this has made any difference. I don't think anyone who watched the policing of the protests summer of a year ago feels that policing in the United States has been reformed. And certainly the number of killings has continued unabated. The reason these reforms haven't made any difference is because they can't make a difference, because they profoundly misunderstand the nature of the problem. Implicit bias training, one of the most commonly implemented reforms, imagines that the problems of the racial disparities of American policing are entirely unconscious and unintentional and rooted in the discretionary decision-making of individual police officers who have overstepped their role in some way. But first of all, we have a problem of explicit racism in American policing. When we look for it, we find it in the chat boards and the Facebook pages, too often in the official statements of police union leaders, some of whom are, implicated in the storming of the Capitol or support for it at least. But we have a bigger problem than just explicit bias by individual officers. We have a problem of institutional racism. And that is that the American institution of policing is deeply rooted in a history of racial exploitation and the suppression of social movements for liberation. Policing in the United States is created to manage the three dominant systems of economic exploitation that were in place in the late 18th and early 19th century. And these are colonialism, slavery, and industrialization. And in different regions of the country, we see the development of policing in direct relationship to these forms of exploitation. I argue that the first modern police force, not just in the US, but in the world, was the Charleston City Watch and Guard, created in the late 1780s. They were professional 24-hour uniformed civilian law enforcement officers, but the laws that they were enforcing mostly revolved around the management of a large mobile slave population. And the solution to the profound injustices of that form of policing were not to give them special training, body cameras, or more oversight, because they were doing exactly the mission that they had been created to perform, which was to prevent slaves from engaging in uprisings, learning to read, forming underground societies, and engaging in disruptive or so-called criminal behavior. Similarly, out west, police forces are formed in relationship to colonialism, and in the industrializing north, they are created to manage the influx of new immigrants who are taking part in the new industrial economy, suppressing not only organized resistance, but also micromanaging the public behavior of these new populations to try to mold them into a stable, docile workforce. So how did we get into this mess of thinking that we could solve the problems of policing with a series of superficial, completely inadequate interventions like body cameras and de-escalation training and community policing. Well, the problem, I think, is rooted in two dynamics that have driven the kind of mainstream political thinking about these issues. The first is a kind of legal formalism in which our elected officials have largely bought into a kind of liberal myth-making about the nature of American society and the political and economic systems that guide it. They imagine that police are a professional, neutral institution whose job is to enforce the law in a professional manner in such a way that automatically benefits everyone. It creates a kind of level playing field. It establishes a rule of law, and that this is automatically beneficial to all segments of society. But this is, of course, a profound misreading of the nature of the legal systems that we live under. There's a famous 19th century saying that the law in its majesty forbids both the rich and the poor from sleeping under bridges, stealing bread, and begging in the streets. But of course, the rich don't need to do these things, only the poor do. And when we organize the law to defend a system of profound inequality, material inequality, even the neutral and professional enforcement of that law carries an extra burden for the already most vulnerable communities in our society. Take the war on drugs, for instance. Created not to produce public health or public safety, but instead created as part of a cynical, racially motivated politics by the Republican Party in the wake of the victories of the civil rights movement. The Nixon administration and the Republican Party more broadly needed a strategy to try to win over historically Democratic voters in the South and increasingly in parts of the suburban North. And they knew they couldn't bring back segregation, but they said to these white voters, look, the Democratic Party abandoned you by passing civil rights legislation, and we're going to be the new party of racial animus. And we're going to do that by waging a war on crime. And the federal plank of this new war on crime is going to be the war on drugs, an issue that has historically been handled primarily by the states. But Nixon said, well, drugs travel across state lines and sometimes international borders, and therefore we can demand a federal role. He creates the DEA, he ramps up penalties. This endeavor is so successful in mobilizing racial animus that the Democrats feel they have no choice but to join in the party. And by 1994, you have Bill Clinton radically expanding this approach. So this legal formalism has led people to embrace a whole set of so-called procedural justice reforms that claim to restore public confidence in the police by enhancing professionalization and reducing bias. And you'll always see with these kinds of interventions, this language about restoring trust in the police as if it's our fault that we don't trust the police and that our perceptions need to be managed and manipulated, which is exactly the purpose of procedural justice. It does nothing to address the actual injustices of policing. Instead, it attempts to present policing in a more professional manner. Officers explaining why they're doing things, listening to both sides of the story, following proper procedure so that people feel better about the outcome, even if it remains substantially unjust. And this, of course, is the problem with the war on drugs. A totally lawful, procedurally proper, even unbiased low-level drug arrest is still going to ruin some young person's life for no good reason. There's absolutely no justice in it because the legal frameworks that the police are enforcing are themselves fundamentally unjust. And the solution to this can't possibly be to give narcotics units anti-bias training. The only real solution is to get rid of the war on drugs. The second mistake that politicians make is that they have, in the face of a globalization that they helped create, have capitulated to a kind of race to the bottom politics, a kind of neoliberal austerity in which local governments compete with each other in order to retain capital by offering tax breaks, cutting social spending, offering incentives, in hopes that some of the people they're subsidizing will be so successful on the global stage that some of their wealth will magically trickle down to the rest of us. But of course, that's not what's happened. Instead, it has produced wildly out of control inequality, a class of billionaires and declining living standards for all the rest. It's produced mass homelessness, untreated mental health and substance abuse problems, failed schools, black market activity of drugs, sex work, and stolen goods out of economic desperation, and then has relabeled all those social problems, problems of crime, to be managed by policing. And so it has turned economic and social problems into criminal legal problems and said that they are the result of individual and group moral failure that will only respond to punitive interventions, thus letting themselves off the hook for their role in creating these deep inequalities. And the solution to these dynamics is to demand that we have an actual program for racial and economic justice, and that we have resources made available to communities in distress to both improve their overall political, economic, and social conditions, and to directly and immediately address the problems of so-called crime and disorder that have historically been turned over to the police. This means getting police out of schools and replacing them with counselors, restorative justice programs, family supports. It means getting police out of the mental health business and creating real community-based mental health services that were systematically defunded in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It means getting the police out of the drug business and creating harm reduction strategies, legalization schemes, but also the kinds of targeted economic investments that can create more stability in the lives of people who've turned to drugs out of a kind of sense of hopelessness and self-medicating the trauma and pain that our current system is inflicting upon them. And that's what's happening all across the country, despite the mainstream media rhetoric that the movement is dead because there aren't massive street protests or because we lost a couple of elections. Instead, I see hundreds of efforts underway all across the country to create concrete programmatic public safety interventions at the neighborhood level, as well as citywide, creating non-police crisis response units, getting rid of school police, creating new community-based anti-violence initiatives. And this work is going to continue because grassroots organizers all across the country are committed to a vision of public safety that's not rooted in the violence work of policing. And I think that makes a good transition to turn it over to Kay, who can talk concretely about some of the organizing that's been going on here in New York City. Kay?
Thank you so much, Alex. That was so crystal clear. And that's actually exactly what I'm going to do in my time before we open this up for a discussion and a Q&A. So I want to take this talk and just kind of like provide a sort of like a series of field notes almost about what we've been doing on the Defund NYPD campaign, but also like, you know, just personally for me, like what my assessment is about the current state of organizing, composition, where we are now, where we're heading, what is our current assessment, some challenges in developing solidarities in this particular fight to massively rework state capacity to take apart necessarily racist and violent institutions and build up the infrastructures that can actually sustain people, right? I think that right now, one thing that people are just feeling is a kind of whiplash, and it comes from being maybe a part of campaigns or organizations that emerged or developed or gained steam at the height of tremendous political activity during the George Floyd Rebellion, which shifted social relations enormously, but like not enough, right? So now we're in a place of slowed or stalled momentum. In some cases, we're in a place of outright reaction. And in general, we are all living through a pace of political life that we're more used to, even as we also have to continually reassess where we are and what's transforming around us and what's possible to win that's going to get us to the place where we really want to be. At the same time, I think it is, sort of useful to back up from just like the kind of almost exclusive or framework, exceptional, actually, that's what I'm looking for, the kind of exceptionalizing framework that we can give to the sort of the past 18 months, to the degree that 2020 saw like crises of like an unprecedented scale and pace, and then responses that were similarly kind of like unprecedented at scale, although precedented in kind, right? I think that we should really note that we're in like a pretty long historical arc, that in one sense you could kind of you could look at sort of 2005 in the Paris banlieue, 2011 in London, the Ferguson Rebellion, Baltimore, and the George Floyd Rebellion as all being like part of one historical process in which police violence in overdeveloped and abandoned places led to the deaths of working class Black people, which then led to kind of urban uprisings, right? So this is a kind of like a long historical arc. In another sense, you could also think about this historical arc as stretching back to Watts, right? And the long, hot summers of the 1950s and 60s and 70s. And so as we try and like assess the kind of problem at hand, I think that it is actually like really helpful to think about the sort of the transformations of policing and state capacity, and responses to these things over within this kind of like really long historical pattern, so we don't just get confused or bewildered by either short-term wins or short-term losses, right? Or by things that are neither wins nor losses, like the conviction of Derek Chauvin, which is not a win, right? It's nothing, right? It doesn't change anything. It is similar to all the reforms that Alex was talking about that changed nothing, right? So that I think that kind of historical situating will give us some clarity about the work at hand, and what we are trying to do when we talk about defund, and why this is an attempt to fundamentally change the nature of policing, and to transform what this particular like role and function of this thing is, as it's like kind of dominated or choked city budgets progressively over the course of the past 40 to 50 years, right? So okay, that's all my framing. Let me do some actual assessments. There's a media narrative right now that defund is a dead project, and the things that people name about this. So what are they going to talk about? They're going to talk about the Eric Adams victory. They're going to talk about the India Walton defeat. They'll talk about the defeat of the ballot measure 2 in Minneapolis. And these are like real challenges for us. I'm not saying that they're not challenges, but I think that we need to like also be kind of, I think that we need to be kind of determinate and really specific when we sort of assess what these mean for us. One thing that's kind of interesting about Adams, for instance, is like he won, yes, because he ran on a kind of like the sort of, right-wing public safety platform, but also because he burnished his credentials as someone who has a kind of credibility around like reform measures or things like that, like reforming the NYPD from within. This is kind of how he became famous, like first in the 90s, right? This was the start of his political career. So in a sense, the people who voted for him did not vote for him as a reaction. Again, this is my read. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but this is my read. They did not vote for Adams as a reaction against 2020, but because they thought they were in continuity with it, right? They were wrong. But this is like, I think it's important to assess, especially when we're trying to figure out like actually kind of why Adams is like such a formidable opponent on this stuff, because people in some sense see him as like some kind of champion of the kinds of like changing policing, better policing that like Alex was talking about. But that's a little bit different from the outright reaction to 2020 that we've seen characterize other political moments or places. And I think that so being specific about that is important. I also like, I think that there are some people who really believe that right now we are living through, because of a kind of dominance of like media propaganda about like about crime, and about which people actually they do believe, right? Even though crime has gone down, people believe it's going up, and they do that because the media has kind of like trumpeted this. It's actually before the George Floyd rebellion. This narrative started in April 2020, and we kind of saw it happen, right? At the same time, I think it's like, I think that we can just, it's not as if we are just reliving the 90s, right? We are living through a period with a difference, because social forces have transformed very dramatically. And for what it's worth, I think that consciousness has expanded pretty dramatically. I think a really good example of this is actually like some of you will remember that I'm talking to people, many of whom have like an NYU affiliation. So you probably remember this like pretty well. But like back in the summer, the NYPD like attempted to start clearing Washington Square Park at 10 p.m. And it was clearly supposed to be the kind of thin edge of a wedge that would have like transformed the park substantially from the thing that it is now of like being a kind of a meeting place between like a number of different classes, those kind of bourgeois tourists, NYU kids, the guys who play chess, people who are like using or sleeping or whatever it is, right? Into a more like thoroughly like kind of bourgeoisified space, and they did so very violently, and the effort failed because it was so this could have been something like the Tompkins Square Park police riot, the 1988 Tompkins Square Park police riot all over again, but it wasn't. And it failed because it was like morally unconscionable. There was not actually the kind of public either apathy or support that could have sustained it, which is to say that when we think about Adams, and we think about Adams as like a pro-police kind of force, it's not as if we're kind of going into the same situation as existed under like Giuliani, for instance. So there is a kind of transformation or a shifting of consciousness that, again, I think testifies to some of the strengths of the movement, and also some of the things that like the riots of the George Floyd rebellion made possible. What does all of this mean for defund? I want to like maybe just take up like a couple of the criticisms in order to either contextualize or negate them. And one is that some people are like looking at the kind of either the slow pace of transformation or actual setbacks and saying, okay, well, the problem here is that defund is a really bad slogan. And it should never have been a slogan because it polls so badly. The problem with this claim, and this is a claim that's repeated like in sort of pretty bad faith from some people who are simply like not on side, and like they simply do not care. They just are opponents, right? So it's very cynical, and sometimes it's repeated in relatively good faith from people who actually want like the left to win and they're scared about this. They think it's a bad issue. The problem is that defund is not a slogan; it's a demand. Right? It's a program. It is a program to massively retool and remake state capacity. Right? It is a program to radically diminish the size and scope of policing, to give people what they need, to provide resources for the forms of public safety that can actually keep people safe, right? Which police do not do. And so the kind of the claim is like, well, defund, like, it doesn't pull well, but like, okay, wait, like, you have your comm strategy, and that's your fucking excuse my language, that's your fucking comm strategy, right? You find a way to like do good messaging for the thing that you want to do that is like kind of controversial, and it's controversial because like for all kinds of reasons. 40 years of right-wing propaganda, the intimate relationship between policing and the circulation of capital, like at the urban scale, right? At the same time, your comm strategy is not the same as your demand. So I don't think that that's like actually really a problem. It's just, it's not like the death knell, it's just a challenge to think about how to work with consciousness as it actually stands for the people who stand to benefit the most from a radical reduction in the scale and scope of police capacity, and to build the power of those people so that they can win, right? That's the real challenge. And so this is, okay, I'm gonna like try to wrap this up in a couple of minutes because I just like really want to like mostly talk about this. But I hope that this has been like instructive and illuminating so far by way of context. I guess like here are some other considerations that I want to offer right now about like assessing the situation and what we do within it. In some sense, all of us who are doing this kind of abolition work are fighting a tremendously hard fight on uneven but generally unfavorable terrain. And at the same time, I think that there are some elements that give us that can offer like real encouragement for the, in some sense, astronomical advances that this movement has made over the course of the past like 30 years. So one is this kind of example that I gave about Washington Square Park, in which that could have been Tompkins, that could have been a repeat of Tompkins, but it wasn't, right? And so we have to ask, like, why was that not true? Another, I think, like interesting test of a kind of shift in composition and consciousness. I'm not a huge fan of it, but you can talk about something like the progressive DA movement. There are all kinds of reasons why I don't think that this is necessarily like the way forward or the best thing. I basically think that it's like not something that the left should really work on or sink our resources into, but liberals are sinking their resources into it. And I actually, overall, I think that that's like, it offers them interesting information. So like when Larry Krasner, the kind of progressive former public defender, now district attorney of Philadelphia, was up for re-election this year, he won his primary handily against a very typical law and order opponent in the Democratic primary. And then he won his general election also very handily. And this was after there had been like a really substantial pushback against him from the police union in Philadelphia, from right-wing elements within the party, also right-wing elements within the city, right? And Philly's police forces, which was responsible for the Move bombing, is sort of famously like really explicitly racist, really explicitly white supremacist, in a way that is a little bit different from what we see here in New York. So that's interesting. It's an interesting test. And you can sort of offer for that as well. Chesa Boudin in San Francisco, George Gascon in LA. Again, I don't think that these are like necessarily movement victories because they're DAs, they're top cops. But it's an interesting testament to the breakdown of that kind of coalition that Alex was talking about, that formed between the 80s and the 90s, that like made it impossible to be scare quote soft on crime, right? There's actually like a really major transformation there. I guess Minneapolis, the defeat of ballot measure 2 sucks, but close, like 45% of the city voted in favor of disbanding the police department. That's massive, right? So this idea, like, that's really, really, really big. That is better than defund polls in New York City, which is around like a third. So it's not a majority, but it's that is a mass movement, right? There is a real potential of a mass movement there. Again, the defeat really stings, but and like, you know, I think that we should like be careful about the fallout there, because, you know, is that going to energize like certain forces that we don't want to energize? But like that it's not as if this is like a fringe position. That's not a fringe position. 45% of a city is not a fringe position, right? Austin, the ballot measure that would have required a massive increase of policing failed by a massive margin. It was like 68% of people voted against it. And that is, again, a totally different terrain from Minneapolis. Like Minneapolis obviously was like super affected, was the heart of the rebellion. Austin was not, right? And nonetheless, like this thing, I see Ben's camera turning on, so I'm gonna wrap this up super quick because I guess we're kind of coming to time. So I think like this, and I guess the final thing that I'll kind of say about this, what have we done in the Defund NYPD campaign? We are working on a pretty standard inside-outside strategy. We elected the DSA successfully elected 2 city councilors this past year. We also attempted to electoralize defund by having a bunch of other candidates who we thought would win their races and we thought were aligned with us sign a pledge to say that they would support our demands. So that was like a kind of early attempt to build out our block. The question of what we can win given this composition is, I think, yet to be decided, and is really, this coming year is, I think, going to be like a test of that strategy, building power on both inside and outside. So I'll stop here and I'll just like see where questions are. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you so much, Kay and Alex. Those are both really rich presentations. I think set the table well for a solid discussion. Remember, please drop your kind of thoughts in the Q&A kind of tab. We can kind of call on you as the night progresses. But let's just start with a question for both of you. Alex, maybe you can kind of go first here. But, you know, you both mentioned and gestured to the kind of like coalition which crystallized in the 70s and 80s and the 90s and has kind of sustained a pro-carceral, pro-police kind of politics. And what's been so impressive over the last few years in ways that you both kind of detailed impressively and with a host of kind of national examples is the kind of fissures in that kind of pro-carceral coalition, that kind of pro-cop bloc. I guess I'm really curious about what kinds of demands or programs or campaigns have been especially effective in different locales at starting to break down that pro-police kind of coalition. And do you still see some of that pro-police coalition? Do you think that it's still strong in some parts of the country? Is its kind of persistence part of what explains what happened in Minneapolis, or explains what happened in Buffalo, or explains what happened in other parts of the country in this most recent electoral cycle, including here in New York? So I'm kind of curious what you kind of make of that. How powerful is that kind of pro-police bloc? And what have been the effective kinds of political work to break that bloc apart?
So I think it's important to make a distinction between two really different parts of the so-called pro-police perspective. So on the one hand, you have the real back the blue crowd, the police unions and their most ardent supporters, Trumpists, who are really committed to a kind of authoritarian neoconservative backlash politics. And then you have the liberal commitment to policing that is evinced by, you know, big city Democratic mayors and the center of the Democratic Party. And they, in a way, are just as committed to policing as the back the blue crowd. They just wanted to be a kindler and gentler and less racist policing, which it turns out isn't really possible. And so they can't even get like superficial police reforms passed anymore because everyone's kind of seen that there's no one behind the curtain there. That centrist bloc, and we have to remember, policing is a local matter in the United States. It's city by city. It's not a national policy issue. So I think it's most fruitful to talk primarily about the big cities. The rural areas are dominated more by the back the blue crowd, the elected sheriffs and the smaller police departments. But the big city departments are in cities with Democratic mayors. They often have, you know, non-white police chiefs, a growing number of non-white mayors, right? And somehow policing is still at the center of their politics. And that is because they are deeply committed to neoliberal austerity. They don't have a progressive urban politics independent of that. And so to me, what's interesting is the battle between that centrist neoliberal austerity politics and a new politics that is in direct opposition to austerity and understands the organic connection between austerity and repression through the criminal legal system. And so it's no accident that someone like India Walton or DSA candidates who won election here in New York in the city council and others across the country are both anti-carceral and anti-austerity. And that has to be the new politics. I think what's been lacking, though, is a clearer articulation of what a progressive urban economic development program would look like that is not simply rooted in transferring money from the police or a kind of simple welfare state model. That, I think, that problem has not really been solved sufficiently. So what is the basis for a more horizontally distributive economics that doesn't result in becoming Detroit in the 1980s, abandoned by capital, unable to provide basic services, et cetera? How do we prevent a capital strike and produce prosperity for people broadly?
It's a huge question, and all the more challenging because even though these skirmishes around policing are, as you say, at a local and often municipal level, the scale of underdevelopment we're talking about outpaces the kind of resources that municipal governments, county governments, even state governments often have at their disposal to kind of solve. Kay, I'm curious about your answer on this question too.
It's a great question. And yeah, I do want to like kind of just to talk specifically about that kind of like a resource question. It's not actually as if like, even at the kind of the most ambitious like form of like, the Defund NYPD campaign is like cut the budget like in half. Well, okay, so like the operating budget of the NYPD is 6 billion, total expenditure is 11 billion, $3 billion is about 3% of the city's total budget. So that's like, that's good, but it's not actually going to solve like the problem at scale. So it's not just sort of a simple arithmetic bet, right? But it has to do with kind of like building up social forces in other ways, but also building power in other ways. In terms of like where, what has been effective for breaking that police block, I really think that, the most militant and organized teachers unions, I think have like really pointed the way forward here. I think that Chicago is a fantastic example, as well as Chicago and LA. Unions that were a big part of the Red for Ed strike wave, like that. Those were often coupled together with like demands that have actually not necessarily been enforced in those places, but have been enforced elsewhere for police-free schools. And so like the ability, what this points to is like a developing ability of like labor to exercise class-wide demands, right? In a way that can actually substantially isolate police as a political force. Because as Alex kind of points out, but it bears saying the police are not just like civic agencies, they are a political force, right? And the people who are behind them are also a political force who want to reorganize society in like some really drastic, very explicitly as opposed to implicitly or objectively white supremacist ways. So I think that like in situations with strong and radicalized labor unions, we can actually manage to create like a kind of coalitional force that really can like isolate this particular kind of reaction. And I think there's a couple of good like
as long as those unions like the Chicago's teachers union are organizing on a social unionism basis and not just to get their 3% for their members, potentially at the expense of larger social demands.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, totally. And also I should say like actually, there's also, that's not like the only situation under which like police-free schools has been like obtained. I was just talking to an organizer with a police-free schools campaign in Winnipeg, which has been like very successful, but like there's a really weird alliance there that has to do with like actually does have to do with like a kind of austerity condition. So like none of the people who are like, yes, we'll cancel our law contract with like school resource officers would admit that it's because SROs in Winnipeg are like vigorously anti-Indigenous. They would just say there's no money. So like that's a really weird kind of like coalition, but it was also a win. So like, you know, I don't want to just, I don't want to be too, I don't want to be too like abstract about this, but I mean, I do think that, you know, Chicago is like a really good example of like of like social movement unionism that can really exercise like really broad like liberatory demands for everyone and a living wage for the teachers themselves.
I'm on mute here. Those are a really good set of answers. You know, I want to kind of probe that question a bit more and talk also about the kind of spade work, the kind of neighborhood level initiatives that you were gesturing to, Alex, in your presentation, and you touched upon briefly as well, Kay. And, you know, when we were kind of doing some canvases for some of these city council candidates earlier this year, back in the spring, it was often the case that you'd kind of knock on somebody's door and a longer term resident would say that the issue that was of the biggest concern to them was in fact antisocial violence or crime. And it was a real tangible fear that a lot of people had. And you have those conversations, and it also becomes clear that the people with those concerns also don't have a whole lot of love for the cops, understand the cops are racist, discriminatory, they can't necessarily be counted on. But it wasn't even necessarily part of the public discourse, and there weren't even concrete alternatives people could necessarily point to understand what would be a kind of community alternative to the kind of violent intercession of police into personal conflicts that individuals might have. So I'd be really curious to kind of hear about the kind of solidarity or community-based alternatives that people are starting to experiment with, and what role you think that might play in this kind of ideological kind of battle to show that safety is not identical to police, but maybe it's opposite.
Well, I think you've diagnosed the situation fairly well, which is, when people are told the only option is available to address their very real concerns is policing or nothing, people will reluctantly often embrace policing. And so we do have to do that on the ground work, neighborhood by neighborhood. And that's what had been going on in Minneapolis. That's what's been going on in Austin. That's what's been going on in Oakland and a lot of other places, but actually had not been going on very much in New York, where the dominant discourse around policing was one of oversight and some procedural reforms. And so that groundwork was not in place when the 2020 uprising happened. It had only been in the months, just a few months leading up to this, that we saw a pivot of that organizing. So what we've seen in places like St. Louis, in Oakland, is two types of interventions. One that is modeled on a kind of mutual aid, self-organized kind of responses, where people within the community develop denser networks of support and identify existing resources and try to develop them out so that if someone, for instance, is experiencing intimate partner violence, they have some resources that they can call on to try to resolve that problem before it escalates and without having to involve the police or children's, child protective services, et cetera, which comes with all these horrible collateral consequences. The other trajectory is a little bit more state supported, not always, but it's the kind of credible messenger model that's receiving some minimal state support, but in a lot of places. And this is the idea of hiring people within the community who have a history of street involvement, violence, the criminal legal system, but have kind of turned themselves around, so to speak, and want to act as mentors, role models, street mediators, et cetera, to try to interrupt the kind of tit for tat violence that often characterizes the insecurities that people feel in these communities. And so they can speak to young people from a position of mutual understanding and respect, rather than a police officer relying on coercion, intimidation, and violence. And it turns out that when we use those kinds of methods, they typically are much more effective, informal over formal social control. There is tension between self-organized, independent of the state interventions and interventions that receive state funding. So for instance, so many of the credible messengers started as independent community-based efforts, now receive state funding, and this has a politically neutralizing impact on the work that they do. And it also sometimes comes with pressures to cooperate with the criminal legal system, at least indirectly, and that can be problematic.
Yeah, I think that Alex probably knows a lot more of like the landscape of this stuff than I do. But I'm gonna offer the following speculation. I think that one place where I see a potential developing strength that can enable infrastructures of safety and care and resources that can step in a time of crisis, I think could come from something like a tenant union. And that could be a means by which, and I can't think of like an example of like, so this is me kind of like thinking in the abstract, well, sorry, I can think of an example because I'm a member of a tenant union that does this stuff. So, you know, maybe, and that wasn't actually me being coy. It was me being maybe a little too, not giving enough credit to the work that my own neighbors have been a part of. Okay, so let me actually just give this as an example. One thing that the Ridgewood Tenants Union, I think, has done really effectively since the start of the pandemic is build up some of these kind of like mutual solidarity activities, some resource distribution, Narcan distribution, stuff like this. It's actually like in a neighborhood which is pretty mixed between like immigrant populations, low income renters, and like very conservative or like right wing homeowners. So there's a lot of there is violence from some people in this neighborhood towards the unhoused people who live here. One of the things that RTU has done is attempt to form real solid connections among neighbors that enable intervention in crisis situations without a police response, right? And so like I think that like, you know, there are kinds of questions that I have about that as like, you know, organizing, like how does that scale up and things like this, and what is necessary to make this like really possible and active and effective at scale. But you know, I think the one thing that strikes me as effective is that it is like the union is a means by which, the tenant union is a means by which people with very few resources can join together on the basis of their shared tenancy and belonging in a neighborhood, but relative lack of control over that neighborhood, and by way of like being together in this way can also begin to address each other's needs. So that I think is one potential way forward. Yeah, I'll end there.
I find that really compelling, though, that, you know, unwinding the kind of power of police is going to involve, on the one hand, a kind of like political program that matches defunding the police with an even more robust reinvestment in you know, kind of social spending. But also by the same token, it has to be kind of like joined by community and grassroots alternatives that can actually provide people with a tangible sense, and even the shorter term, about what other kinds of forms of kind of common prosperity, collective safety might kind of feel like, in ways that empower them precisely in the ways that police don't. I guess, like, you know, it's a really big task. And it seemed the kind of work and the time that it takes to build those alternatives, or to even kind of start to assemble the kind of coalitions that can actually win the kind of program at the level of the state, at the level of kind of budget fights, that seems like it's going to take some time. And that seems to operate on a very different timeline than we maybe thought we were on last summer, as far as we've kind of come with the kind of, as you mentioned, Kay, like 45% of kind of voters in Minneapolis calling to disband the police department. It seems like a huge leap forward from 2 years ago, but maybe seems like it's a slower path than we thought maybe we were on just last year. I guess my question for both of you is, how are you thinking about the timeline for these kind of struggles? As it seems like we're buckling in for what is going to be a lifelong fight. Like these have always been intergenerational kind of struggles. How do you kind of think about the timeline for the political tasks ahead, and how do you sustain yourself, and how do movements sustain themselves for maybe a longer arc of struggle than maybe they thought or anticipated when they first got involved, first threw themselves into the fight?
So I was part of a national gathering the January right before COVID of grassroots abolitionist community organizers from all across the country. And everyone in that room, I think, had this feeling that we were at the beginning of something, not that we were about to win, So those folks were working in local communities to try to get rid of school police, or to try to get a different response to mental health problems, or to get a different response to communal violence, and to get rid of a police training thing, or to block the police budget expanding. These were concrete, somewhat manageable goals that were still aspirational and were rooted in a larger, more radical analysis. But this, and of course, it was because that work was going on that the movement was calling for defund the police and not more money for body cameras or police training, right? It's not an accident that no one was holding up signs calling for that. It's because of that organizing. Well, we had a reconvening of that group a couple of weeks ago, and the feeling is that, well, that was interesting the last year and a half, but it doesn't really change the basic equation here, which is we've got to talk to people one-on-one in the neighborhoods about concrete interventions. And now a lot more people have kind of heard of this idea. Some of them have negative views about it. Some of them remain agnostic or whatever. And some people now are excited about it. And so, but we just have to build on that. And we're not going to win this on the editorial pages or on the CNN. And we're also not going to win it by blocking a particular bridge or highway. That's a tactic that can be part of a strategy, but the politics has to be won through community organizing and tenant organizing and workplace organizing, and talking to people that you don't already know about things that are important to them.
Yeah, I super agree with that, which means that the work is like very slow. Very slow because yes, you can like put out a mailer and you can put out a video, and sometimes you should do those things. But like ultimately the kind of like the spade work, as you put it, is going to be like one-to-one conversations. I think it is like important to just think about like the kind of continual transformations of policing. You could say like since the end of World War II, to think about like we think we know what our opponent is, and we do to a certain extent, but it's also always in like the process of transformation. So hopefully we're smarter than they are, and hopefully we are able to like anticipate another transformation that looks like to some people looks like the thing that they want, looks like a win but isn't a win, right? But like I want to just kind of leave that open to go like we actually need a kind of like constant like vigilance and assessment to sort of understand the nimbleness with which capital in the state and different blocks within capital in the state have very successfully been able to reform their own police practices, of course, incarceration itself, over the course of like a long arc of like, 60 or 70 years. So that's on the one hand, and on the other, I think like to the extent that I think there's a kind of like, let's say shared theory of change that's being developed here, which is like, we're not just going to like kind of achieve abolition by way of going like, oh, we got rid of the bad thing, we took it down brick by brick, and instead, the process of abolition, including defund, right, is a process of transforming social relations, transforming social consciousness, changing property relations. And I don't think ultimately that we can win the things that we need to win without massive redistribution of resources. I don't think that we can win those things without like ecological justice and without like a really like strong environmental movement, right? So like, which is to say that the kind of the struggle for abolition is, this is how we put it, the struggle for abolition is the struggle for socialism. Like they are intimately related. They are different ways of talking about a similar process. I think they have to go together. And therefore the scale that we're talking about is in some sense the scale of social transformation that we think about in organizations like DSA, that we think about as socialists, right? And maybe that's not everybody in this room, but I hope it is, right? Or at least that you are somehow like aligned in this way. Whatever, maybe we can talk about that later. But like, the kinds of transformations of social relations that we need for abolition are the same ones that we need to secure the kinds of institutions and class power that can provide actual substantial full liberation for people, that can provide a kind of massive, strong, resilient popular front against white supremacy, right? That can secure the ability, like everybody's like access to like means of life. And so I think like this is the kind of scale that we're operating on, which isn't to say, oh, we have to kind of like, wait, I don't know, decades to win. In decades, social conditions will have transformed enormously, right? But like this, I think, is the kind of thinking that we need to have, because we are not in this for like a short-term policy win. We are in this for the sake of building a mass movement and like building like substantial class power. And that is the scale that we're operating on, and that is the patience that we require right now.
Yeah, that was a really kind of that was a really wonderful, I think, summary from both of you, and it reminds me both of a number of kind of lines from Ruth Wilson Gilmore's work, both about abolition, the importance of thinking of it not just as an absence of a police, but a presence of concrete alternatives, but also an abolition that's necessarily green as well as red in terms of it kind of attacking the kind of vicious kind of inequalities of market dependency, but also green in terms of kind of remaking whole environments that have been kind of scarred by a kind of abolitionist kind of geography, or rather not abolitionist, but a carceral geography. We've been speaking for a little over an hour now, and it's been a really rich discussion. I want to kind of kick it off to both of you for kind of final remarks right before we close.
Well, I just want to start by thanking everybody for having us be part of this conversation in this series. And as an academic, I'm required to recommend at least one book every time I speak. So I'll recommend two, which are Derica Purnell's book, Becoming Abolitionists, which is just amazing. I think a transformative kind of experience for a lot of people. And Geo Mar's book, A World Without Police, which I think makes a really strong set of historical and international arguments about the fundamental injustice of policing. And the last thing I'll say is that do something. This work is happening. It's happening here in New York City. It's happening in a lot of different dimensions in a lot of different parts of the city, and people should find a way to be part of the solution.
Absolutely. I don't know if I have a reading rack. I do. I guess I do want to. I guess the thing that I just said, I want to kind of introduce a sort of dialectical but at the end of that. So it's like, on the one hand, yes, we are like, settling in for the long haul. We are, committing ourselves to doing like really hard work under difficult circumstances. That's just it, right? It's like the hardest thing that people have ever done, right? Not like, defund, but the whole process. That's on the one hand. On the other, like, one thing that we can surely expect is that there will be other moments of severe rupture like we witnessed last May and June. That's definitely going to happen. Like, this is not, you don't actually have to be a kind of, an evangelical of this stuff to understand that. You just have to be someone who's read the news for 15 years, right? So that seems like really important to think about. One of the things that we're doing, like the work that sustained this movement between 2014, 2015, 2016, and 2020, that made it impossible for the response to 2020 to be body cameras, right? That was blocked, right? That never, like, 8 Can't Wait, like, was dead on day one, that kind of bullshit reformism, like, really, and that was made possible by really difficult organizing under difficult circumstances for kind of like 5 years. Similarly, like, we can think about the work that we're doing now, like all this very careful, like the one-on-one conversation, the really annoying research, the very unsexy work of like trying to figure out how to retool the budget, recomposing like power blocks, activating more people into politics, developing our own skills as organizers. That, to a certain extent, is like that. We think that there can be payoffs in the short term, sure, but also we do this, I think, in the knowledge that there will be another rupture. And it might be one that we've seen, like something similar to what we've seen over the past, again, like 15 years. It might be something else. Within this rupture, in this period of rupture, we need to be ready to say, this is an actual the transformation that we can affect, and to use that rupture to our advantage. I don't think that the left was really ready for 2020 because no one was ready for 2020, right? And I don't think that we should build ourselves kind of in waiting for it to come back, but we should know that there will be something else, right? And that kind of, I'll say, preparedness, that kind of preparedness and patience. I think that's the space that we're in right now.
Well, Kay, Alex, thank you so much. Thank you, David, and everyone at NYU for helping make this happen. Have a great night.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Alex. And thanks to NYU folks.
Take care.